Welcome to the Athlete Brand Advisor Podcast, featuring interviews and news about NIL. We also have special episodes to talk about recent news, events, and anything in the world of sports. The podcast is brought to you by Pliable, a full-service marketing company, an NIL agency that educates and empowers athletes to build their athlete brand. Now, here's your host, Greg Glynn.
Thanks, and welcome to the Athlete Brand Advisor Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about children's books and the state of hockey. I'm excited to be joined by Heather Rule. She's a freelance sports writer out in Minnesota, and she is a great award-winning journalist located in the Twin Cities. I've been out there. I've met her actually at the high school tournament that I'm sure we're going to talk about. How can you not, out in Minnesota? And she's also the author of 13 nonfiction children's sports books. Heather, welcome into the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I like to say here, Girls Rule should probably be the name of this episode because you do a great job covering women's sports. So let's start with that. When you were coming into the world of journalism, tell me how you got your start, because I know as certainly a female in a industry that, you know, typically has had more males than females, breaking in and kind of breaking through that barrier and covering obviously hockey, which you're very passionate about.
Sure. Yeah, with journalism too, my very first start was in news. I had a couple of my full-time jobs were at a couple different outstate newspapers covering crime and city and education and all that. Although my passion was for sports, that's what I wanted to get into. It just at the time was kind of where the opportunities were after college, where I found kind of that passion for sports and journalism and combining those two. And then about 10, 11 years ago, moved back to the Twin Cities and just really kind of wanted to find my next step and dive into sports reporting, which is what I really wanted to do. And hockey is something that I've always, watched for the past 20, 25 years. And it's been, fun to combine the two things, the passions of writing and watching sports. And hockey really lends itself to that here in Minnesota. Obviously, There's when I think about, how many different levels I've covered with hockey. I mean, there's the Wild, the Frost, high school, college, youth. There's so many different teams and levels and tournaments and programs. It's really lends itself really well to having some great coverage here.
And then talk to me about how you decide what you're going to cover. Obviously, you're a freelance reporter. Talk to me about what kind of captivates you into a story, or, is it dictated by, what's getting clicks?
Sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of it is, kind of, I joke sometimes, well, I go where they tell me. If I'm working with certain companies or certain outlets, a lot of that I've done with the Star Tribune, for example. I cover a lot of high school sports for them, and a lot of it is, well, I'm at this game tonight because that's what they wanted covered, and that kind of thing, or this tournament. And but I've also, as a freelancer, got to be a little more independent with some of my coverage the past couple of years. I worked at Minnesota Hockey Magazine as an editor, and this year too, I just launched a Substack for my Minnesota Frost coverage. Written Rules Sports is what I call that. That's kind of been my theme the past few years, hashtag, all that kind of branding there. But so I started out this year with the Frost because I really have seen the past couple of years just how, exclusive some of the coverage could be. It's not the media saturated area that, some of the other sports are, like even the Wild, you have multiple beat reporters there, every game, every practice. It's kind of hard to find that niche story that maybe other people aren't writing about. And with the Frost, there's, there's media coverage. It's limited. There's not as much as other sports. There's not as much as the other pro sports. And so I was just kind of finding my niche there a little bit and thought, there's stories here that can be told that really no one else is telling. And so that was kind of my interest there, as I wanted to really give that a go, especially this year, and just tell some of those stories.
And especially from an athlete branding perspective, I think about that all the time. I mean, I say every athlete has a story, right? And you're the one who's be able to uncover these stories because it's kind of an untapped market where I like to say women's sports are flourishing. And this is an opportunity for someone like yourself, somebody getting into the business, to cover these sports, because the more coverage that they get, the more tickets that will be sold, the more people will come to the games, the more people will pay attention, to watch on TV, etc. And having been on that side of it, there are so many stories that can be told. So I'm so glad to hear that someone is diving in on that side. Just try to give me a little bit of an idea, maybe of maybe your best story or something you've worked on that you really were really proud of, that because you felt like it told a story about a person or a team that people probably had no idea about.
I think the big one that comes to mind for me is a few years back. Actually, it was right kind of before the pandemic hit, I think. I did a story about Winnie Brown here in Minnesota, who's part of a hockey royalty in Minnesota for sure. There's, I think, one of the people I talked to for that story, called her the baby Jesus of women's hockey, or, she's on the Mount Rushmore. And, I think girls hockey players that grow up in this state, I think so many of them have probably been coached by her or been at her camps or worked with her. And so I really wanted to do just a very deep dive profile story on her and a little bit with her family too. This was when she was playing with the Minnesota Whitecaps, which her dad was a
Yep.
coach for, and they helped start. And her sister was on the team too. And so I talked to, I think, more than 20 people for this story, and just wrote a very kind of enterprise, in-depth feature about her. Her importance to hockey in the state is incredible. She's one of the commentators at the intermissions during the girls state hockey tournament on the broadcasts, and just very knowledgeable about so many of the players, and has done so much for the sport in the state. So an incredibly nice person too, always very she's incredibly busy, as you can imagine, with all the coaching and everything she does, but just always very good with her time. And just so that was one of the stories I was really proud of, that I got to talk to her and so many people around her about what she means to hockey in Minnesota.
Well, let's stick with that theme. Obviously, the growth of women's ice hockey. I mean, it has been something that I've been watching, obviously, for several years now. I mean, I remember going to high school hockey games when I was in high school and watching girls play, and the speed just wasn't there, right? And now we've seen over the past, really 10 years, the speed, the quality of the play. I think the way that they skate is just so much better. The way they shoot, the strength on their skates. Obviously, the physicality has started to pick up as well. Talk to me about what you've seen with the growth of women's ice hockey.
Yeah, I think you're right when you talk about the difference we've seen over the years and how much things have improved with the skating. And I think the physicality is a big one too, because I think that's one that for very casual hockey fans or sports fans, they just can be dismissive, I think, on that stereotypical, well, it's women's hockey and they don't have the checking, and they're not really that physical, they're not like the guys and that kind of thing. And I think it really has changed a lot over the years, and especially because I think, the girls and women that are coming up now, so many of them have now they started as kids playing girls hockey and playing with girls. And, even now, I mean, I talked to one of the players the other day, and she said, well, I grew up, playing boys hockey. And I think that's still a very common thing for, I think, some of the women now in the PWHL. That, yeah, I grew up playing with the boys. Maddie Rooney, the very first story I did with Minnesota Hockey Magazine, I usually tell people this story. So the very first story I did was she was the goalie for the boys hockey team at Andover High School. And, that's kind of been a very common thing. It was common with Winnie too. And I think that's the cool thing, is you'll get to see these girls playing girls hockey from when they start all the way up, and that there's opportunity there. There's teams, there's tournaments. It's not like, well, we play boys hockey because there wasn't a girls team, and I think that that's really important too, just to have those numbers and the growth. And, we especially see that here in Minnesota, obviously too.
Yep. Kind of sticking along with that same theme, you've obviously written some children's books that we were talking about. Obviously, let's talk about some of those books. You've talked about a few different topics where you've been writing about women in sports. So let's give you a chance here to talk about those children's books.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like I was saying to you before, the very first ones I did for this company that I work with, and they have these different series and titles that they kind of pitch and work with writers on. And the first one they had was the Women in Sports series. And I knew one of the editors at the time, and he turned to me and said, we should have you do a couple of those, and you'd be perfect for that. So yeah, Women in Sports Media, Women in the Olympics were the first two books that I wrote with this company. And I've done just kind of a variety since then, a couple about, you know, car racing. I'm a big IndyCar fan. I've done, one about NASCAR and Formula One, and the greatest IndyCar or greatest race car drivers, sorry. And I did one about, let's see, Candace Parker, and Wayne Gretzky was another one. And so just kind of really cover the spectrum. And what's interesting to me is just all the research that kind of goes into that. You could kind of know about this topic kind of very broadly going in, but to dive into the research. And there's so much that I learned while writing these books too. And then the latest one I have out is Athletes as Influencers, and digging into the NIL pieces, which was also really interesting, a little bit challenging too, because it hadn't been something that I really dove into with the details and really kind of learned about the history of it and all that. Because it's become such a huge topic and a huge issue the past few years, obviously with all the changes that have gone on. So it's been really just fun and interesting to learn along the way as I'm writing these books and doing the research for them.
Well, let's stick with that NIL theme. You're gonna, hit the nail on the head here with me, because that's obviously what Pliable does. Full service, marketing company and NIL agency, represent over 35 athletes across the country, including, of course, many out there in Minnesota and the women's ice hockey world, especially in college. And I wanted to kind of tap into a little bit of what you found most interesting about NIL. And in my opinion, quite honestly, I've said this before and I'll say it, again and again, is that I think NIL was the best thing to happen to women's sports since Title IX, because it now has actually given them a platform and a vehicle to market themselves, rather than what was happening was money wasn't coming into the sport. And as a result, money wasn't coming in. They weren't getting the TV coverage. They weren't being seen. And now all of a sudden, because they are marketing themselves and they're making their sports more popular, they're becoming popular. Now there's demand. So talk to me a little about what kind of some key takeaways you had from, writing that book as Athletes as Influencers in the NIL space.
Yeah, the Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark are two that come to mind when you talk about that. Specifically with, they're obviously two of the huge names in women's basketball, and just talking about just kind of that discrepancy when it comes to the money that they can make, playing basketball in now the WNBA. I mean, they're big college stars, but just from NIL, I mean, they make so much more money. I think, Simone Biles too. I write a lot in the book about Olympic athletes and kind of the decisions a lot of them had to make of going to the Olympics or being a collegiate athlete, and kind of choosing a little bit because of these NIL rules. And how Simone Biles, I mean, most of her income was NIL. And so I think it is so important when you're talking about, just the like you mentioned, the women athletes, and how it has changed things so much and for the better. Because as these, as women's sports continues to grow, I mean, it still is not in many ways on the same level as their male counterparts. And that's not, that's just reality. It's not, as they're growing and as they're continuing, they're still in the early stages when you look big picture at the history of how long, the NBA and MLB and those leagues have gone on, just that kind of thing. You look big picture. And so it is good to see that women's sports and pro sports, collegiate sports are growing. These athletes are having those opportunities. And I think NIL is a huge part of that, to help them so that they can play their sport and focus on playing their sport, or focus on, staying here, or not going overseas and playing or taking up some other job because all they have is the income from, this sport that doesn't pay as much and that kind of thing. So it's a very big deal. And to see how those rules have changed over the past few years has been huge.
Well, yeah, certainly even in the high school level, having them start to learn earlier and be able to be college ready, as I like to call it, for NIL. You don't want to get on campus day one as a freshman and then start learning about NIL. You've got to build that following. You got to, grow your athlete brand and start to build that at a very young age. So that all makes sense. Now let's talk about how people can continue to follow your work and the great coverage that you provide. So hit us with some of the places people can follow. Obviously, you talked about the written rule earlier. I would love to make sure that people can see your work because you do a fantastic job.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I usually say I'm on the socials at HL Rule, at HLRULE. I kind of, cover Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky. I'm kind of triple posting there when I'm at games with in-game updates. Those are kind of the three. Instagram, Facebook, do dabble in the TikTok as well. My website is heatherrule.com. And then the Substack is Written Rule of Sports. So yeah, go check that out. That's kind of where I've been pumping my Frost coverage this season. So
well, it's been fun to watch. We'll continue to certainly follow your coverage, the Frost and all the women's ice hockey out there in Minnesota and the great state of hockey. And thanks again for all the coverage and thanks for your time today.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for reaching out and for having me. It's good to talk to you.
You too, Heather. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I'm Greg Glynn. We're glad you could tune in and stay pliable, my friends.
Thanks for listening to the Athlete Brand Advisor Podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes from today's episode and catch up on recent episodes at pliablemarketing.com. Be sure to follow at pliablemktg on social media to follow athletes who have NIL representation and work with Pliable. Have an idea for our podcast? We encourage you to share topics and guest ideas by emailing our production staff at info@pliablemarketing.com. We love hearing from our loyal listeners, so jump in and be part of the podcast because, well, that's how we roll.